I would say the people who usually always attend who weren't available today really insisted on having access to a recording which we publish on YouTube via Join Up. So those recordings are always very much appreciated by the community. So do know, voilà, that we will record this event. So without any further ado, again, many thanks to the whole team and Pavlina for coordinating this big effort. And so without any further ado, Pavlina, giving over the floor to you.
Thank you, Sid, and good morning to all. It's always a pleasure having you here on board. As Sid mentioned, this is the last of the overall five webinars that we had on core vocabularies. And the intention is to, as we say, to create a new major release of core vocabularies based on your contribution and triggered by the fact that the initial major release was in 2013 and it took a long time since we have an overall view on all vocabularies. Perhaps you may triggered by the previous slide saying a consolidated view on core vocabularies. I would like to combine the version of all vocabularies. It was triggered by the fact that in our previous building, in the corridor, we have a huge picture of all core consolidated diagram on core vocabularies. So the intention here was to, along with the revision or the major revision of core vocabularies, to create such diagrams. Here, during the five webinars that we, along with the current one, we focus on the four core vocabularies: core person, location, business, and public organization. So next slide, please. And here we are today, the fifth webinar. So what is the roadmap? What is our intention? Our intention is by end of December to reach a consensus on several things that we are going to discuss later in details, and to produce by next year a major release publication. It was also highlighted by Jim asking when we will we will create the updated version of CCC-EV. This all comes into that scope that we want to reach a consensus on all the vocabularies and then create the major release. So for this, I would like to share the fact that it is our intention to create all types of gradually all types of serializations for all of vocabularies. So for certain things that you will see in the sequel, we will need your consensus and feedback. Next slide, please. So during the discussions that we had in the previous webinars, we always came back to the definition, to the original definition of core vocabularies, which says that core vocabularies should be simplified, reusable, and extensible data models that captures the fundamental characteristic of a data entity in a context neutral and a syntax neutral fashion. So next slide. So we have always several discussions with some more isolated user cases by several member states where presented, meaning that some examples were presented. However, we tried always to keep a balance between the use cases supported and the level of complexity, having always remind the reusability not to deviate from the original scope. However, since from time to time, different use cases were expressed and presented. We thought that it could be very fruitful for us to gather and have in writing, collect those different use cases into GitHub. So if something is really needed and it is used by several stakeholders, we can consider it during the future work. So for this, as you will get into the presentation, we created into GitHub a specific link which is used to as where you can provide us information with your use cases. Practically, it's it's a web form into GitHub where we would like to gather information for each use case in a more structured way by saying, for example, what is the status of your use cases, who is the creator, which are the involved stakeholders, what it takes the use case as input, what it produces as output, what is the exact problem that it tries to tackle, what vocabularies and standards are used, what is the current solution in the provide us a link if it is feasible, so that we can take a glance. So we strongly encourage you, if you have a specific use case that has an impact, may have an impact on for future work, not during we will not consider it during the current release, to be taken under consideration. We will be very happy to receive your feedback. You will see the presentation. You can see it in the root directory of GitHub, the different use cases, but you will have also the link by when we will provide, we will make available the presentation along within meeting minutes. Next slide, please. So, triggered by the very fruitful feedback and request by Anne, we created a set of regarding some inconsistencies that current definition of core vocabularies have. We tried to create a set of good these principles for creating good definitions. So we listed those definitions into GitHub. We tried to find the most common and basic, widely used, such as avoid using circular dependencies, use singulars, in order to revamp the definitions that we are currently have, which is one of the tasks that concern the forthcoming release in January. First of all, it is our intention to revamp the definitions. When we reach a consensus about the status, the properties of and the relations of the vocabulary. So I hear background noise, sorry. In order, please, I would kindly ask to mute yourself. I don't know who it is. So in order to be in a line, please validate provide us a feedback in case where some of the principles from the ones that are listed is not this important and is not listed in those that we provide into GitHub, so that we can have a common understanding and proceed with the revamping of current definitions. This is one of our future steps. So, as I mentioned before, the common intention is to create a consolidated diagram having the intersections and interdependencies between core vocabularies. So we created, based on the current modification on the core vocabularies, we created a simplified as well as a more complex consolidated diagram, which I would like to present to you. Both diagrams reside into GitHub, you can find it at every specific vocabulary. In order to present the consolidated diagram, we thought that it will be better to present it through an example. So I pass the floor to my colleague Emilio to present the example along with the consolidated diagram.
Thanks, Pavlina. Before sharing the floor with Emilio, let's have a look together at the core vocabularies and indeed a simple example that will introduce us to the consolidated diagram. And as Pavlina mentioned, the core vocabularies that are in scope today are the 4 of them. Most of you know them, and they try to capture the fundamental characteristics of key concepts. And what we have here today, but which is only a part of the core vocabularies that we'll see in the consolidated diagram, are the 4 that we see on the screen. So really the core person vocabulary, which is about the concepts describing a natural person, its name, his name or her name, the date and place of birth, etc., etc. The core business vocabulary, where we really look at business that are legally registered, and there we look also at the company type, the type of activities, how was it registered, etc., etc. And then the core location vocabulary, where in alignment with Inspire, we try to describe a generic location in terms of address, geometry, geographic name. And finally, the core public organization vocabulary, which is more, as its name says, focusing on public organizations, and so organizations active in the public sector, and try to define there what are the events that led to the creation of the core public organization, its hierarchy, how is it structured, etc., etc. With that being said, let's look together at a simple example in the next slide, where we have Isabel. Isabel is a person that just been hired by a company called IT Consulting Corp. And in the country where IT Consulting Corp is active, there are subsidies in order to hire young people that are female, so basically women, and therefore IT Consulting would like to verify the age and gender of Isabel in order to be able to claim its eligibility to get the subsidies. Those subsidies have been defined in a law, and the subsidies themselves, all the procedure, etc., are part of a public service that are provided by the Ministry of Interior. And the law is, as I said, encouraging IT businesses to hire women under 24 years old as part of in the IT domain. And so, all this context being put, IT Consulting Corp is asking Isabel to provide some certificates, in this case a birth certificate, to prove her age and gender. And on top of that, IT Consulting Corp is also requiring an extract of National Address Base Registry in order to prove that they actually are eligible for those subsidies, and basically by saying that they are based on the right jurisdiction in this case. And once all those pieces of evidence collected, they share it with the authority, the public organization, in order to claim the subsidies. That's, in a nutshell, the example we would like to look at. Now, if we look at the concepts that are behind this example in the next slide, we'll see that, okay, we have a person, that's Isabel, we have the legal entity, that's IT Consulting Corp, or in other words, a business. We have the subsidies that are provided by a public organization, that's the public service itself. And then we have the law in which the public service as well as the requirements are defined. The law can be seen from two perspectives, and we'll come back to that. That's a reference framework, all legal resource. And then we have the company, or the organization that is providing the service. That's the public organization. And then we have different set of requirements that includes the fact that you need to prove that the person is under 24 years old, that it's a female, and that the country is active in the right country. And finally, we have also the basis of evidence that are provided. And in one case, the piece of evidence is also showing the address. The address is also a concept that we target as part of the core location vocabulary. So all this being said, let's look at step by step how this is structured according to the different core vocabularies. So if we start with Isabel as a person and IT Consulting Corp as a legal entity, those are two concepts coming from the core person vocabulary and the core business vocabulary. Straightforward so far. And if we go a bit deeper in the next slide, and we see that IT Consulting Corp, in the next slide, thanks. Here it gets a bit more complex. We see that the service on the top, on the bottom right, the service provided, so obtaining subsidies or providing subsidies in this case, are defined within a law. This law is a legal resource on the top right of the screen. And this law is provided, is under the responsibility of a public organization at the bottom of the screen. And the legal entity, IT Consulting Corp, takes a role in this public service by simply providing and claiming its right to get subsidies. And that's what legal entity is able to do, so to participate in this public service by playing a certain role. Here, thanks. It's really claiming the right to get subsidies. Then if we look at the requirements that are provided, that's another perspective. And basically this is coming also from the law, but in this case, it's described in the CCCEV core vocabulary, where the law is the reference framework under which the requirements are defined. And we will come back to this difference, but basically there's a link between legal resource and reference framework. But what is important to know is, depending on your use case and the way you want to describe it, you may need both or one of each, and they are not contradicting each other. Then indeed, diving into the pieces of evidence that are provided, we have Isabel as a person that is providing the evidence on the top, and this evidence is supporting a certain requirement. In this case, the two requirements of age and gender. And then when it comes to the last piece of requirement, proving that the company is active in the right country, we have the legal entity that is, the legal entity that is active in a certain address. So requesting an extract of address in core location address. And this legal entity is, thanks to this address, this extract showing the address, is providing this as an evidence on the top. Voila. Providing this extract of address as an evidence to support the requirement, and afterwards combining all pieces of evidence in order that met the requirements in order to claim the public service. And that's what we have again in the middle. Voilà. And so if we look at this from a general point of view, what do we have? We see here all the simplified version of the diagram with the all core vocabularies. So the 4 that we described plus CCCV and CPSV, the core public service vocabulary application profile. And it's really, here too small to read, but we'll dive into it right after. And all the elements or the key elements that we described right before are present here in a consolidated way.
Question from Cecile, that asking whether we already looked at powers and mandates.
As part of core person and the consolidated diagram, or more generally in this example, no. But I think this is something valid that would be a future use case. I know also that power and mandates is very complex from one country to another. So if you have more info about this, feel free to give it in the chat and we can look at it further.
The intention to clarify this is since we are revising, we almost they are revising every vocabulary individually. We wanted to see how this to create a consolidated diagram. So the intention of the example is to see how the flow is when we have such a simple use case, and whether something, for example, is missing and we cannot go from one vocabulary to another. It is a preliminary experimentation, or say, and honestly, we haven't thought about diving into powers and mandates. But it's a very good remark, and thank you for this.
And I propose now to look a bit further at the simplified diagram with Emilio.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah.
Now we can hear you, Mehdi. Yes.
Yeah, sorry. So thank you, Florian. The idea indeed is to show a simplified diagram, which is indeed simpler than the one that you received by email, because the one consolidated one is really full, rich with all the classes in each single core vocabulary. Here we try to highlight the main concepts and at the same time the relations between them. If we go on the left-hand side of this diagram, we see the 4 of them. Here we have the person, legal entity, address, and public organization. I'm going to take it down here. So on the top left, basically we have the person, which is indeed from core person vocabulary. It's been derived from the 4th person. So we have the 4th vocabulary here. and which in turn is a subclass of agent, quite abstract, let's say, a concept on which we derive also other concept. For example, the legal entity, indirectly, because a legal entity, as you can see here, it's a subclass of form organization, which is in turn of organization, and again, FOF agent. The fourth person and legal entity here, they share, for example, other classes like IDMS identifier for identification of the person and the legal entities as well. If you scroll a little bit down, we have also the location part in place, because the person itself has, for example, relation like country of birth or place of birth with the DCT location, so from Dublin core side. The core location is not just only that. We have indeed other classes like geometry, in case we want to define a more detailed part of the location itself, and in particular the core location address. We have the core in which is linked with a person per se, and also legal entity in the form of the registered address. We will see other details along the issues that we will deal today. Scrolling down on the diagram, we have also the public organization. So the core public organization is a subclass of org organization, which in turn, if we scroll still up, again, we are basically subclass of agent. So it's most of it is basically derived from FOV. Public organization as well as link towards core location address, so the address part. And you see now that we go right on the diagram where we reach the public service side, because a public service from core public service vocabulary, we have a competent public service as a competent authority as a public organization. So that's the main link with it. It also a contact point defined so far, so between public organization and public service too. The public service is indirectly linked with the address you see from participation and the agent here from public service dataset. We will also touch that at a certain point in time. And if you scroll on the right-hand side here, we have the other last, let's say, core vocabulary. It's the core criteria and evidence. The two main classes on the right-hand side are, you see, evidence and requirement here. I highlight those two because they are the most linked. First of all, evidence with so many relations towards a FOF agent. You see scrolling there, because an evidence can be provided or issued by or is about somebody else, for example, a person. And evidence also supports a requirement. That's the main link over there. And evidence is conformal to an evidence type, which, as you can see here, if you scroll on the left-hand side, and then still again, is maybe issued placed to a certain location. So some other links between the public service and the requirement is that public service has an input also a requirement person. So there are many links between them, different classes along them that, for example, here in between public service and core criteria evidence, we have also cost and channel. Both of them, let's say, are can be linked to. So this is simply, again, the simplified version of the diagram. We just now dig down in all single classes. Of course, the relations are much more in the consolidated one. And we try also, of course, by looking at that to see what can be improved, what can be indeed try to be better integrated between all of them. I go on the next slide. In this slide, we see another example of the usage of core vocabularies that is taken from the public document regulation. The example takes in account the birth certificate that is being published in public document regulation, where we have different sections that can be indeed highlighted if we want to structure such document according to the core vocabularies. On the left-hand side, we see first of all a reference framework. You see, for example, the article of the regulation per se. Then on the right, let's say still on the left, the country where the birth certificate will be issued for. Sorry, I'm going back. The public organization information on which is the issuing authority for the form. On the right-hand side, some information about the document, and in particular, since it's a birth certificate, about the person. In the person, we have some information like a surname, forename, but we have also information about the place and country of birth, which is linked indeed to our location. So I go on the right-hand side here. So we, again, and this is a simplified diagram. If we talk about the birth certificate, we see the same concept that we've seen before. In particular, the person on the left-hand side, again, which is a subclass of person of agent. The address, because we talk about the birth and country, let's say the place and of the country of birth and place of birth with the city location on the top, on the bottom side. We have a public organization which has its own address as well. Let's say it has, of course, it belongs to a country. And we have also a requirement coming from, because we have some requirement that comes from the reference number of public document linked to the reference framework, which is the article basically of the on which the public document is published for. So we've seen before. The evidence and the evidence type, this is a birth certificate per se, and a time period, because these certificate, we've seen it, it's as a date of issue that should be filled. So a period of time which has only start time in this case, but is corresponding to the evidence per se. I don't know if you have any more questions. This. I just want to add that.
More questions.
I just want to add that indeed we try to harmonize as much as possible the vocabularies as possible, and the idea indeed is now, for example, in this case, you don't see core public service vocabulary because we discussed this before in the previous example, but we are working also to align more as well also CPS VIP into it.
Okay, so if people have questions, you can raise your hand in the interface, or you can just type something in the chat, and then we'll give you the floor for your questions or comments. Do people agree that having such a consolidated view is useful for the use of the vocabularies? As you can see, we have here in the diagram sort of trying to connect the different core vocabularies. And you can see that there's this group of 4 on the left is what we also going to discuss in a little bit more detail later. And then we try to connect that to the other things that we're doing that are using parts of those core vocabularies. And then this is something that also shows you what the relationships are and how they interconnect. Okay, so people think it's very useful. I have a question from Riccardo from Italy, asking whether we did consider to mark the possibility of the validity, the start date and the end date of a service.
If I take this one, I think it's a very valid comment. Of course, it's not directly in scope of this change management or review cycle that we are talking right now, but I think it's really valid. If you can, I will share with you the link. If you can post this as an issue on GitHub for CPS VIP, the vocabulary tackling public service. And then the objective, but I see Miguel is in the call, the objective is normally to launch a review cycle of CPS VIP next year.
Miguel, any comment? I don't hear. No. Okay, so that answers Ricardo's question. And I think we also have an activity, of course, around the core evidence, the core criterion and core evidence vocabularies, which you see on the right-hand side. There also we have a review cycle where specific things can be addressed. And in this particular overview, in this particular use case that we presented, we only use a little bit of that core vocabulary, but that's also something, if you're interested, you can be involved in that work. Any more questions, comments? What I gather is that this consolidated diagram will also be available on on GitHub. So if you have a printer around the corner, then you can actually print the whole thing out. And I think Pavlina, you're going to do that on the wall in the office. So that's something that you can do, and you can then also zoom in to the various parts to see how the relations are. Florian,
Yes,
yes.
the rationale is that if some of you are using some of the vocabularies, you may use more than one vocabularies. So if you use a public service, core public service, you may also use a core person or core organization. So it makes us totally sense to see how they are connected and not treated in an isolated way. Yes.
So, and on this diagram, of course, as we go along in reviewing and revising the vocabularies, will need to be published on a regular basis to take into account changes that are made to various vocabularies over time. Yeah. So, any more questions, comments? Don't see any hands raised at the moment. So Rob, you have a comment about temporal aspects. And what do you mean by they should not be modeled? You want to talk, Rob? Or keep on typing in the chat if you prefer that? Yeah, a little far away.
Okay, I'll try to come a bit closer.
Yeah, we can hear you. And we can see you.
It's also
Go ahead, Rob.
to be specialized in bitemporal data management. Currently working as a data architect for one of the Dutch registers, government registers, the Handelsregister, the Chamber of Commerce. I think that especially on when you're on ontology level, if you model general aspects like temporal things, then you get a clutter of things that you know that are there and that are everywhere. So if you can leave that out in your model, you can focus better on the functional aspects that really matter. I don't mean to say that temporal aspects don't matter, but if it's everywhere, then don't put it in your model. That's my point.
Okay. So there
Makes
certainly
some sense.
Well, there are certainly things where we need.
Yeah, my camera is working. Yeah.
So I think there are certain things that in temporal aspects in our core vocabularies are necessary. For example, a birth date is something as a temporal aspect that needs to be there. But I think you're referring to things like validity periods.
Yeah, I mean life cycle things.
Yeah.
So a birth date, I see that as an attribute of a certain entity.
Yeah.
But general aspects as when did we add it to the data set and what is the validity period that we see, they are general.
Yeah.
So that we make a distinction between them, and if we put valid times on every entity, then it doesn't say anything because we know it's everywhere.
Yeah. So, but that's a question of how you then implement the information that things are valid in a certain time, but that, if I understand you correctly, that's something that is sort of on a higher level in the modeling.
Yeah, I think it's the bitemporal nature of our data is a general aspect. It's everywhere. So leave it out of the model and focus on the functional things. That's something that I find useful in models that already are complex.
Yeah.
To leave out general aspects, just like audit trails, whatever. And they say, well, we'll manage that. We don't put it in a model. We'll focus on the functional things.
That is probably also in response to what Cecile just said, that she was asking whether there should be recognition of a life cycle of things. And I think that's what you're saying. But that is something that life cycle should not be in the model of the things, but should be on a different level.
They're related. Yeah, right.
And then Dimitris has a comment about the connection between CPSV and CCEV. And Pavlina says that it's one of the issues that would be taken under consideration. And as we said earlier, the details of the public service and of the criterion and evidence vocabulary is not what we're discussing in this webinar, but certainly any comments that you have there, we will take them into account on the further development and the maintenance of those other vocabularies. So that's something that we'll certainly keep on our list, and that will come back when we have further work and meetings on these other vocabularies. Cecile, do you want to say something about your comment about the life cycle? Cecile, if you...
Sorry, I had difficulties to unmute. Well, no, I tend to, I like the comment of
Rob.
Rob. And maybe it is because what I wanted to mean is that this is something generic that could be abstracted at an upper level of all these concepts, and there are all come from things, I guess. It's not very visible here, but I don't really know, for instance, all. I'm not I'm not a semantic expert, but I guess that in all you can find some temporal aspects that that deal with this, and things that all things they have they should have temporal aspects, I guess.
Yeah.
Or we could extend that if they don't.
Yeah, it reminds me of a discussion that we had on GitHub where someone was referring to that people will change name or change address or change gender, and those kind of the things that I think are life cycle aspects that we don't model currently in the models of the core vocabularies, but it's something that you would need to look at if you're having a particular application. For example, if you want to keep history of a person's name, then you build that outside of the model of a person. You would just have sort of different incarnations or something like that of a person, but you don't have to put that information into the model for a person. So I think that is from the comments from Rob and your comments, Cecile. I think it's clear that those things are important in practical situations, but it's not something that you want to build into the model, because then you would build something into the model that is everywhere, as Rob says. Okay. Any other comments on the example? Any comments on the...
Can I say something more?
Yeah.
So maybe to position, so from the functional perspective, it's also to position this work as a picture of what, so to have it stated somewhere that this is a picture and not the whole history. I think it's nice to position position this as being the picture of one instant. It,
You mean this is a simplified diagram? You're talking about the diagram, or are you talking about the example?
No, I'm talking about the information that it captures
Yeah.
is about
Please.
at one instant of time. And because we say, okay, the life cycle must be put in aside, so we want to decouple life cycle and what is a person, for instance, a person, but it's a person at one instant, and then have it clearly stated as, because it has a functional, it's to give the functional aspect of what it means, is that you don't want to capture the whole history of the person. You want to capture what it is at one point in time. So in that sense, the picture, I mean, you have a snapshot.
Yeah, okay. So I think that's a good point. I think also that is something that we have had comments about in the case of these life cycle and name changes. And the issue is indeed that you're using the vocabulary to describe an entity at any point in time. Basically, this, for a person, I always compare that to the way that you print a passport. The passport might be, your next passport might be slightly different from this one, but the passport itself, the model for the passport, is the same. And I think it would be good, as you say, to make that statement somewhere in the core vocabularies, that this does not include the life cycle aspects. It's just a description of an entity at a particular point in time. And I think that might be very useful to say. And then I have Miguel saying that it would be useful to identify use cases, how this diagram could be applied. And I think that was something that we said earlier. We have the simple use case of Isabel and the subsidies. Then you get as Emilio was doing, and Florian was doing, having sort of looking at which of the boxes play a role there and how the relationships are there. And it would be very useful, I think, I agree with you, Miguel, to look at use cases. And we have asked people to provide use cases to us so that we can actually see how those can be modeled by having a particular view of the diagrams. And that would actually then also, in a description of a use case, one of the artifacts there would be the diagram and the way that the links between the core vocabularies work. So I think that is something that we can have that on our list to do for the future. And use cases connected to existing EU policies. So that's if you have an example of that, Miguel?
Well, the best example is the single digital gateway, but it's a complex one. There are some domain-specific policies on transport, health, and so on and so on. We can build a catalog to show it to, implementers working on these policies. We can discuss this offline if you prefer, but it requires some.
I think it's an important part where we would be looking. And I think
there are two types of policies: those that are more overarching, like the gateway, comprising 21 set of administrative procedures, but there are other ones more on specific policies. As I said, taxation, transport, move, interior, health. So maybe we can work both levels. EIDAS is another case. Yeah,
I think that's a good point to see how those connections between core vocabularies work in particular use cases, and the overarching cross-border Europe-wide use cases are the most interesting there. A question from Ana Rosa: what about a time core vocabulary? Any views on that from the team? I understand, Ana Rosa, you say, well, if we have these temporal aspects that we're not going to model through the core vocabularies, would we need one separate one that actually defines how we are creating these temporal aspects? Ana Rosa?
Yes, indeed, we are talking about different temporal aspects like cycles, time series, snapshots. Uh, we could. It's just a crazy idea, but perhaps we could develop this time concept in a time core vocabulary that can be connected to the other core vocabulary. So when we need a person through time, or for the different aspects of times, like cycles or snapshots or whatever, we can connect the person with the time core vocabulary concepts, and the same thing for everything,
Yeah.
for evidence, for whatever.
And then I think if that's something that we want to look into, I think also that we would need to look at what is already there. So, for example, W3C's time ontology, and then see if there is a case for us to describe how to use the time ontology specifically for our use cases. And I think that even if set and agree saying that this has already been tackled, I think then looking at how those existing how this existing ontology can be used in particular use cases. And I think again to have use cases that identify sort of the needs of those will help us to identify what we need to do about that. Maybe in some cases we can just point to external specifications and then explain how to use them. And in some cases we might need to develop something, but I think that is something that we can identify. I think the time issue, the life cycle issue, I think is a point that we're going to take into account, that we're going to have on our list of things to talk about. And I would suggest to do that in the context of use cases that need those functionalities.
This goes back to what we mentioned earlier about putting your use case into GitHub, so that with a similar scenario like the one that we mentioned, we just presented of Isabel, so that it will be easier for us to put the request into a specific context and have the same type of simulation to see what is missing and what is needed. So we will highly appreciate if you can do this for.
And I think if I may, Pavlina, I think the use cases have sort of dual relevance for us. In one set of what we want to do with that is that we can provide guidelines. If there are use cases that people provide that are being currently supported by the core vocabularies, it would help to actually explain to people how to do that. So that's one part. The other part is that we can identify things that are missing, as you say, things that new requirements or requirements that have not been completely satisfied. So both for, let's say, education or training materials, and to drive also the further maintenance of the core vocabulary. So we've been in many places, in many cases, we've been sort of hindered by, let's say, sometimes a little bit of a theoretical view of core vocabularies. And in meetings, people come up with ideas and with requirements. It would be really very good to have that as a set of use cases that we then can publish and make available to people, and then also use to drive further development. And yeah, Rita, clearly start date and end date, a concept we all need, and we need that for specific use cases, history use cases, validation use cases, and therefore this is something that we certainly need to be looking at in the future. Any further comments? There's also for use cases that we could look at, ways of visualizing this. I think we have this diagram now with these boxes and these lines. We we're also thinking to publish them in various ways. So one complete with all the boxes and all the lines, then a simplified diagram as you can see here. But also you can see there are sort of three parts of this diagram. On the left-hand side, those four that we're talking about today, in the middle, the public service, and the right-hand side, CCC EV. So we can also see that we are going to be able to publish sort of parts of the diagram with more details. So that's something that we're looking at the best way to visualize them. And that is something that we will be working on the next couple of months. Anything more on this?
Perhaps Max, just a quick question also to the group. I think, well, thanks a lot for this first presentation. I think the UML diagrams, well, they're the basis for all of the work that we're doing, but as a communication instrument, I think especially during these types of webinars, I think they also have some of their limitations, and especially say the experts who have been involved also in the work on the OOTS and the single digital gateway are probably also aware of kind of the work on the user experience, where I would say the visually, in order to explain certain data flows, we visualize things rather through user journeys, and perhaps during early 2022, when we're also developing the new learning materials, perhaps it could be useful to try to combine the UML diagrams, which are absolutely essential, but they're not always very readable on a screen, to perhaps to combine them a little bit with this more kind of user journey oriented way of visualizing things.
Yeah.
But just this is a question to the group. I mean, many of you nationally, you're also presenting this type of work to your stakeholders. Will anyone have a recommendation or an advice or a kind of a comment on how we could perhaps add an extra layer of visualization, which would be more accessible compared to the UML, where we kind of take away some of the unnecessary gritty technical details and we really focus on kind of the key message? Would someone have kind of extra thoughts on that? If not, but I think it would be useful to try to explore some kind of new visualization strategies to really, during these types of kind of ping pong meetings where we throw back ideas back and forth, that we perhaps try to have kind of a different visualization layer.
And I see that Cecile comments there, and I think Cecile is interested in that sequence diagram. So I think what you're saying, Seth, if we have a user journey, then there is actually a stepwise approach that we can present. And in each of those steps, you can actually show the boxes and the lines that are relevant for that, so that you can actually. That's basically what I also was envisaging, which we did. Which we need to look at how to do that, what kind of tools there are for that. And I think, as you said, it would be really useful also to hear from implementers in the member states how they do that, whether they have any tools, whether they have any examples of how they're doing that, and then we can learn from that.
Yeah, but it comes back indeed to the focus on use cases. So in order to have these journeys, we need the use cases, and I think there's a kind of a global agreement that once we have now I sorted out the revision details, that in order now to kind of to document and to train people, that we need to think about different ways of communicating. But so the use cases and these user journeys, I think there will be a good match together. But anyway, that is work for January, February. But if anyone has any thoughts on, let's say, visual communication tools, which we could include in early next year's work, don't hesitate to give a shout.
I do recall that in CPSVP we also once tackle business process modeling as well. It could be a way needed to describe process and activities. It's somehow it's complemented to the sequence diagram that Cecile was mentioning.
But it's basically a communication tool to make it easier to understand how these things work together. I think that's what Seth was saying, and Miguel agrees that these use case and user journeys are a good idea. So Cecile, what does BPMN mean?
The business process modeling notation, indeed, that's
Okay.
the standard to display, to visualize process.
Okay.
Indeed, it's valid comment. We could look into that.
Yeah, if we do something like that, it would be useful.
Can I intervene? So, in fact, I'm contributing to a standardization committee in SEN, and there we want to address as normative statements the processes. So here I understand that we want to limit the normative aspects to the semantics, but still to give an understanding on how these semantics is used. So to have kind of informative information about how the model is used. But still, so I would still recommend that it is using standards for this. So and I see the user stories a bit of higher level wrapping of the story, let's say, and then that you would have a business process model to explain, or an example of business process model, because it is not meant to give the whole all the possibilities, and then that you would dig into more, and then the detail, of course, going to sequence diagrams or is then really quite detailed. And object models is also nice because you exemplify, Isabel is a person, and you see that Isabel is a person and she does this and that, and you have her in the object. So it was why I was mentioning the object model. But yeah, so I think it should be taken care of using standards and not being too vague, let's say, in the approach of explaining what it is. Yeah.
I think that makes sense. So doing things the way that standards can help, and this standard is certainly the one that we can have a look at. Also, but Anna Roos also said that we probably want to keep track of the things that we do by having a repository of user journey diagrams, so that there is sort of a building up as we go along a collection of those things that will help everybody implementing the core vocabularies. Okay. If we have no more comments, we're keeping track, of course, also if the comments that you make in the chat. So we'll take those into account as well in the report. If no more comments, then I would suggest that we have a short break. Could we say that we're coming back here at 10:50? So we have 10 minutes, so you can grab a coffee, you can have a comfort break and stretch your legs, and then we come back at 10:50 to continue.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you. So welcome back. Just to see that Miguel had some comments about how to do these user journeys. Simple ones with UML cases, and then more complex ones using BPMN. Jorge Souza is in agreement. Okay, so we're 10:50. So shall we continue, Emilio?
Yes, sure. Second. So,
Yeah, we can start again.
So second part is about the specific vocabularies and the changes
yes,
that were made based on previous meeting. Go ahead, Emilio.
yes, indeed. We see in this second part the first, let's say 2 by 2, the vocabularies. We in this second part, core person and core location. In the second part, let's say the core business and public organization. In each part, we picked up basically for this main release that we have to put in January, the main important issues that we want to tackle before the such release. We enter now in the core person. So I highlight here once again just simple the core person per se, because we don't have basically otherwise we have again to come back to the consolidated diagram. And on this diagram, we can discuss as well all the next issues. I will use let's say some visuals as well. In person, the core person, let's say, concept has many properties, as you can see. Alternative name, birth name, date of birth, family name, full name, gender, given name, and patronymic name, plus some other relations with other concepts like location, address, jurisdiction, identifier. In this issue that one of the latest issues that applied in GitHub, we have seen the request from Finland and Sweden on the addition of a matronymic name. We have already, as I already mentioned before, patronymic name as a property of person, as a simple text. The idea is indeed for also inclusiveness, not only for, let's say, just for the case of Finland, but inclusiveness, we could add matronymic alongside patronymic as a property in person class. So unless there are any, say, do you see any issues on this or
comments? Any objections? I don't know if people have returned from their break.
Yeah.
But this is something that was discussed last time, and I think what we've said is because there are requests and use cases from those countries, and also because we believe that it's for inclusiveness and gender neutrality a good thing to have both of them. So this should make the people in Sweden and Finland happy. And if there's no objections, then we'll just record that this is. It would be useful if people could say something in the chat, +1, for example, if they agree with this approach. Anyone wants to support this? Rob, I see Rob supporting this. Let's see if there are any. Now, Rosa, you raise your hand. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I would like to say just that I support this proposal, but I support also to include in the core person vocabulary all the specificities in the European country, not only the matronymic, also the patronymic, the second family names, all the different ways that the middle names as well, all the ways we are using in our countries to identify people by name. Thank you.
So this, I certainly think that it's a good point that you're making. I'm certain that we don't want to include those now because, well, we're close to publication. So if this is a case that that people are in agreement with, and I see Cecile being supportive and Jim as well. So we'll put that on the list for future versions to extend the naming properties in core person.
Case by case, yes, of course. Now there was need from Finland and Sweden for this. Definitely, yeah.
I have seen only 1+1 for the metronymic name. Ana Rosa said that she was in agreement with it. And anybody else wants to support? Would suspect that the people from Sweden and Finland would be supportive of this, at least. Norway is in support of this. Let's see if there are any more people. It's a little bit scarce to have only 3+. We have 5. So would be useful if people would say if they're in agreement so that we can actually report that. We can, of course, take silence as support, but I would love to have some more supporting votes. No, Ana Rosa, that's not the question that we have. We currently have this proposal to add matronymic name, and I would want to know if people supportive of that. And we already said that your idea to have a more full handling of names than country-specific names, then we will take that in a future version. I see Cecile also in support of it. So if you're, let's say, if you have objections to it, if you're not in agreement with that, for votes, if anybody on the call has strong feelings against this proposal to add a patronymic name, that says we can conclude. So okay, so we're concluding, we're recording that there is agreement and no objections to this proposal. Again, so Rob, that's an idea to do that. We have, of course, a property which is full name, where you can just put everything that you want in any order that is relevant for your country. So in that idea, we have this possibility to have just a general way of representing names. But if you want to have a use case to have a data type for a person name, then we can actually take that as a use case and then develop that in the next period. But we record agreement on this proposal on matronymic name. Emilio, you can move forward.
Yeah. The before indeed going to the next issue, which is let's say more related in person, you see that indeed we have also. First of all, I want to recall that all these properties are optional, so there is no harmless in adding it. And in the core person, we have, for example, for the person, we have also the date of birth and date of death, which are dates property, as you can see. Indeed, in the next in this issue,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Now we can see.
We tackle this part because in some cases, and there were a couple of issues linked to core person issue, yeah, in some cases the precise date is not known, and let's say there should be a possibility to model this, to describe this. As the date, usually it's a prefixed format, so where you should indicate a day, month, and year. The idea is in order to be flexible, is to create a new sort of data type, which is not simply the date per se, the date from XML schema, but also to have the possibility to specify the year, month, or even simply the year. That's we saw this case, if I remember well, in Germany, where in some acts it's difficult to indicate the exact date of a person. So in order to model this information in a flexible way, we just want to have one date for, let's say, one special date for this case, for birth date and death date, when it's not known. Any other things that we need to add up here, or let's say, are there any other cases in other countries?
So the proposal is to create a new data type date that is a union of access date, access G year month, which is if you don't know the exact day, and access G year if only the year is known. So the idea is that you can use whatever is relevant for a particular person. So I can see Seth saying that it's useful if only the year is needed. And then I see Shaq, Jim, and Ana Rosa in agreement, and also Ricardo in agreement with the proposal to create this union of these three granularities for dates. Anybody more in support? Just type a +1. And if you disagree, please put a -1 there, and then we can discuss your objection. I see Cecile also comes in with a +1. See someone left the meeting. Okay, anybody else want to support the proposal or be counted as an objection? Sander is in agreement. So, Seth, do you think we're ready to declare this agreement?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
we are.
Okay, so we'll declare this proposal accepted to create this new union for dates.
Okay, I move next to the next slide then. We have seen already in the consolidated diagram the concept of person and also address. Person and address as a concept are already linked between each other as with the registered address. But along different issues we see here on 3 and 32 and 35, let's say in core person, we notice that there is a demand, let's say, of adding a concept of second address, let's say. In particular, this could be a domicile. In addition to the concept of residency, which we already have in core person as well. We noted as well, not only by demand, but the concept of domicile is present in the regulation of public documents. So it's then basically what we would like to add a new property, which is domicile between a person and address. So this will be filling the gap with the regulation of public documents, and of course, try to satisfy also the possibility to define such concept of address, let's say additional address, which is domicile.
Can you remind us, maybe Emilio, what
Yes.
the definition is of domicile that we are adding?
Yes, I think I noted that before, but it's basically the where a person is currently located. So as it brings his own business as well there, because then of course it's associated with an address where I need to have we can have some special, let's say, definitions.
For my understanding, so the registered address is where someone has registered with the authorities. I don't know, with the city register, and domicile is the place where a person actually
permanent
lives.
Yes, it's a permanent home. So basically where it's lives there, and of course is yeah, most of the time it lives there basically. So that's why the relation between person and address.
Cecile, what's your question?
What is the difference between these two, and can you give use cases where it's different? Because maybe I'm biased by the case in Belgium where you give your domicile to register. You cannot be registered. You cannot have a domicile that is different from your where you are you reside. So I don't understand where in legal. So it happens that you live in a different place, then you won't tell it. I mean, you just stay in the place. You have your legal place, let's say, and then the one if you move around, you don't have to announce it or to give this information. So I'm a bit, I don't understand.
No, I think, well, we all are limited by our knowledge of the countries that we live, but this was a request to add those, because apparently in countries there are cases where you can have both addresses, the registered one and the domicile. So the registered one and the actual one. So that's what the proposal was, to add this based on the use case of that it is necessary in some countries.
Usually you have indeed one domicile, definitely. But you could have different registered address per se. It depends where indeed which other, let's say, register you are. And the domicile per se is even more complex in some certain countries. For example, we have the domicile of origin, where you were born effectively, but then you change domicile when you see when you grow up.
And also the other point that Emilio is making is that it is actually in the regulation on public documents. So we align
That's the main
with that regulation.
Yeah, that's the main indeed part. So there was a demand, and on top of it, we noticed when analyzing the let's say the public documents regulation, when we analyzed basically the person aspect, the domicile was indicated over there. So we said that, well, it's good that should come indeed from the regulation there. Let's put it on into the core vocabularies.
So in fact, so it would be useful to have the definition of both concepts, says Cecile. I think that's a fair point.
Indeed, and just to have a clear example or use case which highlights the difference between both, and perhaps to have like something like a scope note which perhaps makes the link with the different realities of member states. It would just be good to have a little bit more documentation which formalizes why we need the change.
Okay, thank you, sir.
So, and as we said earlier also, is those things are, all the properties in the core vocabularies are optional. You can use them if you need them, but you don't have to use them. So in that case, we have received a request to add it, and the proposal is to add it for these cases where it's necessary. But we certainly need to make clear what the difference is so that people can use them correctly.
Rob is posted a useful example on this, but when somebody is a student living temporarily away from home, meaning that the domicile in the register address. He needs to have a address where all the, for example, to get a Belgian ID card, but his original address is something is different from the one currently being subscribed into the public organization register.
Just to react to what Sjaak is saying, that there can be an unbounded number of addresses, and that's correct. The thing is that what we are identifying here is 2 addresses that have been identified by our community as necessary for describing a person. Now, if there are other addresses, then we need to have a look at what use cases there are. In one discussion that we had in the past, the additional addresses were sort of historical addresses, but that is something that is part of a use case, of a life cycle use case. But certainly, if there are cases in Europe where there are more than 2 addresses with specific meaning, then we can have a look at that. Ana Rosa, you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you. I just want to say that there are several addresses, not only the domicile and the residency, that I agree that this is the how the public documents express the address of a person. But also, for instance, in Spain, we have an address. People can specify an address for communication and notification purposes. Because, for instance, if you are living temporarily in a different city or country, perhaps you want your mom or your dad to receive the notification because it is easier for you. So, I mean, I agree that we need several addresses in this model, but we need also to know the qualification of each other. If it is the domicile where I currently live, or if it is an address for for the fiscal implications, or if it's for the notification of any communication given in a postal address or whatever. I mean, I agree with the purpose of multiple address, but we need somehow a qualification of what means the address for that person.
Okay.
Thank you.
And I have Ricardo, who says this is important to me. What exactly is the this that is important to you, Ricardo? Is it you're referring to what you said? Is current and valid?
Good morning, Ricardo speaking. I think it's important to mark as current and valid only once domicile at a time.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't see the start date and date for a single domicile.
That's correct, but then we're going back to that discussion about the life cycle and the comment that we made earlier that what you record using the core person vocabulary is the snapshot at this point in time. So by definition, the domicile here would be the current valid domicile.
The current, okay, thank you.
And then the comment from Ana Rosa, if there is a need to expand the number of addresses for a person, then I think we should take that into account based on use cases and seeing how we can handle that. In a way, that's a modeling issue, of course, that We don't really want to have 25 relationship between person and address. But certainly if there are things like you said, the example of a notification address, maybe then in next versions we can actually consider to add properties, or to have to look at a way to do that slightly differently, maybe with contact point or something like that. So let's keep that on the list. For the current situation, I think that just asking people whether they agree with adding domicile to core person, and then we can move further issues about person's addresses to future versions. Is that okay? People want to say +1 to add domicile. Jim is first to agree. And Rosa is in agreement. Cecile is in agreement. Jury is in agreement. Sander is in agreement. So I think we can start concluding. If they're certainly asking again, if you have objections to it, to speak up or to put in the chat that you don't agree. If there's no disagreement in the group at this point, then we're going to mark this proposal also as accepted. So last chance to object, and then we'll move on to the next issue. Okay.
So we've seen now the main issues to be tackled for core person. We move forward to core location. Core location, as I already mentioned before, has 3 main classes from location, from doubling core, the geometry class, and the address class. Those 3 already, let's say, have some relation to, let's say, any single concept can use them with the related relation. So to access to the location, we have the location indeed relation here, the geometry per se, and the address. And RDF resource can be here means any concept that you would have seen in basically in our consolidated diagram, in any concept that we can model, can be linked to this 3 concepts: location, geometry, and address, via the relations that we see location, geometry per se. I go next then to the issues towards the core location, and we see one particular side of it, which is concerning the address class. Now, in address, which has different, as you can see from the image, has a different properties. Among them, there are 2 which are concerning admin unit L1 and L2. Those properties are usually to indicate different, let's say, granularity of the address per se. So there are different levels, and usually this comes from the NUTS nomenclature. So NUTS and the European level, it's used to indeed specify from country level towards basically the region, or even let's say sub-region, etc. Now, admin unit and L1, L2, they are related to code. And there can be indeed additional levels, so they do not allow really flexibility. The proposition here is to create an additional class, which is called admin unit, with the 2 properties, one level and the other one in the respective code. You see on the right hand side here. I'm going to try and zoom in over here. So admin unit. So the address class will be connected with additional admin unit, because it will be additional to admin unit L1 and 2, since L1 and L2 are already from the NUTS nomenclature. So where everybody can add additional codes and the level for it. Going back to it. And so then it will be possible to add to create this this type of relation. Of course, we want to keep admin unit L1 for backward compatibility. That's it will stay there, but we propose it to this additional one. The request was, if I remember well, coming from Germany, but it could be indeed interesting to see how other countries might be, let's say, found useful.
Okay, I see Ana Rosa already saying that she's in agreement with that. So the idea is certainly because these admin unit level 1 and level 2 are already used, for example, by EIDAS, we didn't want to break compatibility with existing implementation, so we keep those two. But then if a country needs more specificity, and Germany was the use case that we had, then this is a way to do that. I guess Jacques and Ricardo and Jim are all in agreement with this. Again, Emilio referred to the nuts. That would be a way to express those things in a particular application. It's of course not necessary. If a country has specific codes for themselves, that is also a possibility. We do not limit the way that you can use it. But in practice, in European environments, that would be sort of the most important code list for usage. But then nuts doesn't go very deep, and there might be situations where countries have neighborhoods or streets in various levels. This can be done then.
Indeed, if I recall well, there is a level 5 in Germany. It's about roads or something like this. So indeed, it's a level detail that we cannot handle with just admin unit L1 and L2. So we need something that provides an extension for this.
I see. Jerry, a good question about whether it's mandatory. It's not. In the core vocabulary, we do not have any mandatory fields. So in your use case, in your implementation, you can decide to use it. But this is something, as you say, in a profile, you can say that that you use these other things. The admin unit level 1 and 2 are still in the address box because of backward compatibility. But if you're implementing a completely new application, you might use the new class for all the levels. That's completely open and completely flexible.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. I don't see any objections to the proposal, so I'm going to conclude that this proposal has been accepted. We can move on to the next issue.
Okay. This is the last issue basically for core location. As I depict here already, we have the, let's say, the 3 main classes: location, geometry, and address with their respective location. We also noticed that we have been using already, as you can see in core person, if you recall well, the property registered address. The property registered address, the relation per se, it's using indeed in multiple vocabularies. And indeed, the request is to make such, let's say, relation more evident, more highlighted in the core location vocabulary. So move it in terms of domain in the other core vocabulary. So other vocabularies can use directly such a register address by simply pointing to it. So the proposal indeed is to move such register address in the core location and not sitting in each simple vocabulary.
So this is a, let's say, bringing this property to the core location vocabulary. It's still can be used as necessary in all other vocabularies, but it's then clearly visible in the core location vocabulary.
Indeed, the exercise of doing the consolidated diagram helped on this, because we looked at different classes, and then together with the request, we said, okay, then it's worth to move the register address in addition to the address relation to core location.
And this was a proposal, a question to actually make it visible as part of the core location vocabulary, so that people can understand when you're looking at the core location vocabulary that this is something that can be used throughout. Any comments there? Any support? Any objections? Please in the chat tell us what you. Ana Rosa, you have your hand up again? Yeah, Ana Rosa.
No, sorry, it was
Okay.
my mistake.
Okay. But you raised it again? No. Any comments on this proposal? I understand people might get tired, but let's see if you have support on this proposal to move the property registered address to core location. Sjaak is in agreement, Jim is in agreement. Just specifically, especially say if you don't, Judy is okay, Georgie is okay. They don't see any objections to the proposal. So if there is no objections, then we're going to also register this as a proposal that is agreed by the group. Yeah, so that's, don't see any more comments, no, any more support, any objections. So we can move on to the next issue. And in fact, we're going to move on to the next vocabularies.
Indeed, indeed. In this part, we see we take all the core business and corporate organization vocabulary, where we deal basically the main issue that we want to solve before the next release. We enter now in core business vocabulary in the main class, where we have, let's say, in core business we have the legal entity, which is indeed the link to a registered address, as you can see on the bottom side, linked with an identifier. It's a legal entity usually as an identifier, and also with a SCOS concept, because let's say we classify entities depending on the on their activity status on type. In the next issue, the idea is, let's say, the request is basically make legal entity, because as we know from legal entity, yeah, it's subclass of org form organization and subclass of agent. Come back to this diagram here. The request is to make legal entity directly subclass of agent, and even to create a new class which is legal entity organization, which is a subclass of both legal entity and org form organization. Okay, so going back to the definition, that the legal entity, it's able to transact business typically registered with a body able to confer legal status, such as a national business register. We already have the type of usage of a legal entity. The proposition is to keep legal entities it is, because it has been always subclass of org form organization. And the diagram originally was a simplification. In this issue that I don't remember who currently opened, the legal entity per se, when we described from the beginning, when it exists already in 2000, I don't remember now, it's 2012, 13. The proposition was always been that legal entity is subclass of org form organization. Indirectly, basically, it's a subclass of agent. So we are not changing, we never changed basically the subclassing part. And all the diagrams that we depicted in the past were simply a simplification to say, okay, legal entity is always a subclass of agent. So there is no, the proposition indeed is to keep legal entity as it is, as a subclass of formal organization.
And I guess what is the additional part, if this is something that needs to be done, then we would need to see the use cases where it's relevant. But in the current situation, I understand what Emilio is saying. This was just an inconsistency in the diagram, but in fact, it was always defined as a subclass of formal organization. So this is more of an editorial problem, I think, than of a modeling problem. Is that correct, Emilio?
Indeed, indeed. From the beginning, we just simplified the diagram, but indeed it's more editorial than conceptual, let's say.
Anybody has any comments there on whether that is a good proposal to not change anything at this point in time, because there is basically what the proposal is to make it a subclass of formal organization was already there. So I'd like to hear from people whether they agree that we don't make any changes on that point. Any supporting comments, any questions, any objections? Please put that in the chat if you're in agreement with making no changes, or speaking up if you think there is something that we need to discuss. Please. If you're in agreement, please put a +1. We don't have any comments. No, we don't have any agreements. Jacques is first one to agree. Any of the others have opinion on this? We could say that if we don't have any comments, then by definition, we're not going to make any changes. So if that's the case, so the proposal is not making any changes. I see very few responses to that. So my conclusion is that we're not going to make any changes. And I see Pavlina in agreement with that statement.
Yes, I agree, because if the working group, the stakeholders are not do not have a strong opinion on whether we should not keep this as we proposed, I think that we go forward and keep things as is. Yes.
Okay, that's recorded then as an agreement, and then we can move to the next one.
Yeah, here we tackle the core public organization vocabulary. As you see, indeed, when we enter in each single vocabulary, there is an explosion of classes that we didn't depict in the simplified diagrams. But at the core and in the middle, we have the public organization class. With different classes around it. For example, the ADMS identifier, again, to identify the public organization, the contact point for it, many more other classes indicating, for example, the home page, the logo, the special part, and also the change event at that time when we discussed. So that's the one. This is the one that is already depicted in place. One issue, let's say, a recent issue that has been opened on for public organization is to request to add a new class to define the public authority organization and subclasses. So Currently, the public organization class, let's say, first of all, there is, as you can see in this diagram, the request is to create a public authority organization as a subclass of both a public organization and a formal organization per se. And in case, let's say, such agreement is being reached, to create also other subclasses like local public authority, regional public authority, and state public authority. So in this case, let's say, first of all, we wonder if there are really any use cases, and if there are use cases, I would say this could be considered for future releases, because it's, let's say, changing not only the way we see public organization, because we are creating also some new concept, but let's say this requires an investigation of what is a public authority per se. So first of all, of course, we need to see what are the use cases. And in this case, I invite you indeed to create a use cases on GitHub, where it's, let's say, we can deal with the, let's say, with the concept of public authority.
And I think there, as I understand it, so there's the proposal here to have this public authority organization, but also the proposal to have subclasses of the public authority organization, whether that's subclasses of public organization or of public authority organization is, I think, a secondary point. The question is, how far do we want to go? I think if we can see that there are use cases where it's essential to be able to identify the type of public organization or public authority to be identified with basically looking at whether these things have very different properties, whether you have to have a different set of properties for a local public authority or a state state public authority. I think those are the kind of things, as Emilio said, we need to see what the use cases are, where there are cases in a country, for example, and apparently there is a proposal here or an issue that was raised on GitHub where there is a need for that, then we would need to see exactly what the need is, and also looking at what then the descriptors are for these different classes, because there's always the thing that you can either add a type property to a class, so that you can say, well, what kind of public organization is this? Or if it's necessary, you can actually do subclassing, but it needs to be based on use cases that show clearly that this is necessary.
But Max and Emilio, I think in order to understand, could you just briefly point out who introduced this request? And if during the request they sketched out a kind of a larger context? Because I think on the whole, we're trying to rationalize things. So if at this stage, and also in the audience or amongst the participants, if there is no clear use case or impetus
It was
to do so?
Peter Brown from the Danish agency.
And did he refer to a specific example?
No, not necessarily. No. That's why the question about the use cases, because let's say from modeling perspective, let's say we cannot let's say anything at the end, because we would need a really practical use case.
Because
Yeah, so I think this is something that is important for us as well in the use case. If you saw the form that you fill in, not just propose a solution, because the solution needs to be satisfying a particular requirement. So I can see in the GitHub issue that he provided sort of a solution, but he didn't actually create a use case for it so that you can actually see how those things would be used. So I think it's always good that people are thinking about solutions, but in order for it to be discussed in the group and in order to find a solution, we need to know what the problem is. And There might be different other ways to solve this problem than the solution that is being provided. So that's very important, and we're going to, I don't think that Peter is on the call, but also we're going to ask him to provide more information about this idea that we can actually understand what the need would be. And Jim already says that in the ADMS publisher type, there is already a controlled list of the types of local, regional, national authorities. So that's something that we then, if we have the use case, then we can see that whether we need to create subclasses or just point people to this controlled vocabulary of public authority types. And Ana Rosa says, just first, Rob van Dort said the general rule, keep it as generic as possible, less is more. And Ana Rosa says that both types are derived from the geopolitical unit of the competencies. That's true. That's why what the difference is between those different classes here. But we just need to see why it would be important for the core vocabulary to identify those particular subclasses. Ana Rosa?
No, I am just saying regarding the Rob sentence, I mean, the less is the more. If something can be derived from other properties, I think it's not so relevant. Here, from my point of view, for a public authority, the relevant thing is the scope, the geopolitical scope of the competencies, and not so much a type.
Yeah, it's a jurisdiction, basically, what we're saying.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll take that into account. We'll keep this issue, of course, on the list, and we're going to try and find out from Peter exactly what the use case is, so that we can determine whether it's useful or necessary for the core vocabulary to incorporate such subclasses. So I think there's no proposal here. The proposal here is that we just wait and see, and we're going to develop further work on this to determine what we need to do. So there's no proposal here, so we don't have to ask people for their opinions here. I hear from the discussion that people do see some need to be able to identify this, but the way we're going to do that, I think, is still open for further discussion. I think that's it for this point. So we're a little early on our agenda, and maybe just have an open discussion if there is anything more that people want to discuss. So we've discussed the consolidated diagram and the way that we can create use cases and journeys, and how we can do that in terms of visualization in the future, both for education and for verification of our models. And then we have looked at the 2 or the 4 core vocabularies that we have handled in this sequence of webinars, and identified the final agreements that we needed to be able to publish the new version. So apart from that, are there anything that people want to discuss before we give the floor back to Pavlina for the wrap up? Anything that people want to raise? Anything that people think we should take into account for the future? Anything that you think we need to do in terms of communication? Anything that you want to bring up? Now's the time to do that. And if not, then we're going to move on to Pavlina. So just give people a minute to think. Yeah.
If I made a quick word, of course, we realize that giving feedback during these extensive webinars is very time consuming. It's not always easy to do this within overpacked agendas. Do any of you, the participants, have ideas on how potentially we could make better use of your time as stakeholders? For example, is there a part of the process which we could do more in a written form, for example? I think the experience of the last kind of webinar shows that, well, we have good discussions, questions, comments, etc. But do some of you think that it would be useful to, I don't know, to have more time based on written preparation of really all of the technical details, and that you would have, let's say, 2 weeks to prepare in advance, having already all of the written out modifications? Is that something which would facilitate your work, or is there any recommendation or comment that you could give to facilitate your life as a stakeholder, to provide us then feedback? Or do you think that the way in which we organize the current webinars works well? Anyone has any comments or any thoughts on that?
The interesting thing is that people are agreeing, but I'm not quite sure what they agree with. I think you made a suggestion set that we publish information ahead of webinars so that people can come better prepared and not just are presented with the proposals in the meeting. And I think that people, and Jacques confirms that his +1 was for more written preparation, so sharing of documents 2 weeks ahead, or at least some time ahead of the meeting, so that people can prepare. And maybe sometimes also, I would guess that people on the call have colleagues that can't be on the call, that are sort of specialists in a certain area that they need to consult with. So that would actually help people to prepare better. I see that Jacques, Alexandros, Rita, Jorge, Jim, Ricardo are all in agreement with that. So I think that's an easy agreement.
We tried to do this. If you notice, lately in our communication letters are reminders that we try to highlight the issues that the most important issues that we are going to discuss. We also sent during our last email the 2 diagrams, the simplified and the consolidated diagram, so that you have some time to take a glance on them, and perhaps make some suggestions that this was towards this direction. But if you have something more concrete, it will be very valuable for us to take it under consideration into our future webinars.
And of course, we have a written collection of issues and responses on GitHub. Now, I know that not all of the people on the call and not all of the people interested are members of GitHub. GitHub has a good function that you can actually watch the spaces where you're interested. So still want to push people to go to GitHub, because that's where you can have more quiet discussion. You can actually think about it, you can react to it, because that's also what we use as the source of our proposals. We look at the issues that have been prepared on GitHub. We try to see whether there is an agreement or there are major objections to it, and we try to find a solution in the light of those comments. So GitHub is clearly the way that you can see what is happening. And then if we then can, as the team, decide that at some point, as I think Rita says, when documents are ripe for evaluation, for discussion, we can announce them to the group so that people know what is being proposed. And also Rob says, at least having info about the topics of the discussion in advance, that would be helpful. And then we could have, first of all, make sure that the agenda and the topics are communicated, and then at the point where there is a written proposal with a justification or an explanation that can be shared so that people can come well prepared to the meeting and are not surprised by some of the things that are being proposed. I think so.
So just perhaps a last element. I think both Paulina and myself would be very eager and enthusiastic to also participate or try to see how we can learn from national practices. So many of you, I think all of you, I assume you organize national, regional, local events on data modeling, where perhaps some of the core vocabularies or application profiles are used or not. I think all of you have expertise on bringing business owners and data modelers together, and you all know how complex it is to make those two groups work together. So if at any point you're organizing, I would say on a national or any level, data modeling discussions, where we could also learn from, I would say, the processes and the methods that you're putting in place. Don't hesitate to reach out, because in 2022, we will really, I would say, now that the revision process has been tackled, we'll also more fundamentally try to rethink how to involve stakeholders and try to emphasize as much as possible a bottom-up approach for the I would say the evolution of all of the specifications we're responsible for. So the more we get feedback and input from, I would say, directly from member states, the better. But this is a long process that we'll embark on during 2022 and 2023.
Okay, I see that Finland already shares information on their interoperability method and tools. So I think that's something that we can take into account, and then anybody else who has information of that, I don't think, I guess said we want to identify also a way of sharing and a way of having that in some way in GitHub or on JoinUp information that we can actually share with people.
But indeed, kind of, this is completely in the line of the work that we're planning for next year to give a better overview of national initiatives in order to identify where we should invest in. And so there is a whole redesign, I would say, of the activities and the functions of the Interoperable Europe unit, and all of this fits exactly together in that picture. So thank you a lot, Rita. For these types of links are exactly the type of information that we need and which we'll bring together.
And then one other thing is that Augusto Herman one asks whether we can do the meetings later in the day, because I'm not quite sure where he is, but he's not in the Central European time zone. I think then he should be west of us. We'll see. We usually take sort of the end of the mornings as a rule. If we have people from the Americas, for example, then we could consider to do it later in the day. But that's something that we can see. Augusto, you can come back to us offline to say what your preference would be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so then let's move on to the wrap up. Alvina?
Yes. First of all, I would like to thank you all for being here and contributing. It was a long road this year with the 5 webinars. As you saw, we haven't done a major revision quite some years. So for us, it was very important, first of all, to tackle all important issues that were put all those those years into GitHub and never been addressed. So our first priority was to tackle the issues into GitHub and create an updated version for each vocabulary. Secondly, it was very important for us to create this the consolidated diagram in order to see how our vocabularies can treat it as a whole, match together, and be useful, because we fully understand that you're not using our vocabularies in an isolated way, but under a specific context, and you're using more than one of our vocabularies, or you're extending one of through your national application or domain application profiles. You're extending more than one of our vocabulary. So it was important for us to have this consolidated diagram, which is in line with the current version, the current agreed version of each and every core vocabulary. What are the next steps now that we come into an agreement about open issues? What are the next steps? As it was highlighted by Anna from Denmark, it is important to revise the definition of our vocabularies. So, as we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we have collected a number of principles for creating a good definition. So, we would highly appreciate if you could provide us for feedback until the end of December, so that we, in January, while publishing the updated release, we revise the definition based on the principles that we agree. Please provide us if something is missing, or we haven't taken under consideration. So please provide feedback for us. What it came out from the current discussion, it was very important, is the use cases. Please provide us through GitHub all different type of use cases that we should take under consideration and be used to better understand the issues into GitHub, but as well as to see what is done for we needed to tackle into the future release, and not in the current release. On the other hand, but also for dedicated issues, please put your issues into the separated, into dedicated issues, into dedicated vocabularies. On the other hand, as we mentioned earlier in the webinar, we would like to provide different serializations. And it is our intention next year to provide the same all serialization for all vocabularies gradually, not once at a time. For RDF and JSON LD, things are quite more straightforward. On the other hand, for XML serialization, things are quite complicated. So the team created a working draft in order to see what is there on the market, what is used by stakeholders, and what are the most common guideline rules that we need that are followed. So, in order to come into an XML serialization, we would like to create to have your feedback. First of all, please consult the link that is provided into GitHub. Perhaps Emilia would like to press to go to the GitHub issue right now, and provide us provide feedback to the issues that we created for this reason. So we would like to have your feedback on which approach is used, which XML ecosystem you are following, what are the base principles of your XML ecosystem. So we have created 4 issues, and how easily it will be for us an XML approach in order to fit to meet your needs. What type of support do you need in terms of codes, enumerations, control vocabularies to be, how should we present it in the XML core vocabularies, XML serialization, what are the common usage patterns to support, what the minimum information should be required. So we would highly appreciate if you could provide your feedback into the 4 issues that we have created for this reason, revise, take a glance on the study, the first outcomes of the study. Who said that? The outcome of the study that we have conducted and provide us with feedback so that we can see how we will move towards next year, to what direction to move towards next year in terms of XML serialization. Because we want to provide solutions that can be easily used by our stakeholders and not need a significant effort to adapt them to their national up and running and production system. So this is the roadmap for next year. Your feedback is needed. We will share with you as soon as possible the minutes as well as the presentation so that you can have all GitHub links. We can also, if you identify some some inconsistencies, for example, in the consolidated diagram, please let us know if something from our side is missing. And we would like to thank you all for your support, and we hope that we can see you in a few days into the same conference. So thank you so much from my side.